In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Thank you, dear Lord, for this day. Thank you for this opportunity to gather together. And we ask you, Lord, that you would be with us, be in our presence, that you would help us as we look through yet another courageous character, to learn from their courage and to apply it in our own lives. Thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to gather and open up scripture. Hear us as we say, Lord, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Earth as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. In Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. So here we are.
Daddy,
Those of you who aren't here, you guys are missing a beautiful view. All right. So quick recap on kind of where we went last week. And the goal of this series is talk about courageous characters, because we live in a time and an age where we need to be courageous in what we do, because there's a lot that is under attack between our beliefs, our faith, like attacks on our children. So much is happening on a global, local, institutional, and personal level. And I'm sure everybody in different ways can reflect on their life and think of an area in their life where you feel that you need more courage in acting how you kind of envision or hope you would see yourself acting. And so our goal in this series is to talk about different characters and what they had to overcome in order to act courageously. And we began this kind of reflecting on Pentecost and how on the day of Pentecost was highlighted not only by the speaking of tongues, but also by the courage that the disciples and the apostles and the early believers began to show, because in the face of a lot of opposition, a lot of risk, with a lot being at stake, they chose to be bold, to be brave, to be courageous in what they, in not only in what they spoke, but also in how they acted. And so from that point of Pentecost, leading up to the decades to follow, millennia, and centuries and millennia to follow, what we saw was the church grew as a result of the courage that the early believers were showing, right? And we capture this in martyrdom, because they gave up their life, which was the greatest thing that they could give up. And because many people saw that, and because many people admired that act of courage to give up their lives, they started to believe. And so what we saw is this relationship between the courage that the believers showed and how the church grew, and the number of believers that, the courage that the martyrs showed and the number of believers that joined the church. So we saw this relationship. And likewise, when you really kind of fast forward, we also saw a decline or like a much slower, I think it's fair to say, like a decline in the number of people joining the church, because we weren't being as courageous as before, right? So there's this relationship that we see throughout history up until today, and as we state our faith, the only evidence that we have that gives credence to whatever statement of belief we adhere to comes in our actions and our responses, right? So people can only verify what we believe based on looking at us and seeing like how we act, and then looking and saying like, okay, well, does their action match their statement of faith? The only way to verify faith is to look at the action. So we kind of opened up that idea, and last week we were talking about courage, and we also quickly looked at the biblical word of courage, and how it paints this picture, especially when you're looking at the Hebrew word of to grow strong or to make, or to grow or to make strong, right? So it paints this picture of growing and of evolving, that it's not a fixed state of being, but it's something that we can grow into. Likewise, like, you know, we, the other word that is used for courage gives this picture of, you know, making somebody firm, all right, or strengthening somebody, or proving to be strong over time, right? So these are the Hebrew words that we have in scripture that give us this picture of what it is to be courageous. And from that, we kind of looked and we said, okay, well, there are two elements that we wanted to highlight with regards to courage. And the first one is that courage is a choice that we make. We choose to be courageous, right? We choose to make a personal decision to maintain a position or to take certain steps in the face of opposition and risk, right? So there's a choice to be courageous. It's not innate, right? It's not, you know, automatic. It's a choice that we make, but at the same time, what helps us make that choice is the sense of purpose, right? Purpose, which, you know, when there is a divinely inspired reason, that fuels our choice to be courageous, right? Because we get this understanding that we are aligned with what God wants, right? So the sense of purpose and choice are two parts that work into being courageous. And we looked at two examples, right? To make sure that these elements were there, which were the three youths, how they made a choice to be courageous, even though their lives were at stake. And then also St. Mary, she made a choice to be courageous, to accept what the angel Gabriel was saying to her, even though it was going to come, you know, at a cost to her. But in both situations, they both had a sense of purpose as to why they would respond in the way that they did. And then lastly, we looked at Moses and how we saw him as a courageous leader. But, you know, what we looked at with Moses and what we're going to look at today is we're always trying to highlight, well, what's the obstacle that this courageous leader had to overcome in order to exhibit courage? And with Moses, we said that he had to deal with his past, right? And then going home and facing his people and facing Pharaoh, these were all, you know, elements of his past that he had not dealt with when he was in the 40 years of the wilderness. So he had to deal with the past. Likewise, like we have to, when we are, you know, choosing to be courageous, sometimes have to deal with our past in different ways. So that's what we did last week. And so kind of looking into this week, I got two questions to get us going. Is what are important issues to you that you feel the need to speak up about, right? So we're trying to highlight, like, you know, it's more of an introspective question, and hopefully, you know, some of us feel comfortable sharing, but what's something that's really important to you that you feel like, I really can't keep silent on this issue? I really have to do something about it. What are those issues? Online, just double checking. And you guys hear the question?
Abuna, you muted yourself. No, we did not.
Oh, you didn't hear the question. Did you at least hear like the talking?
Oh, we heard the question. We didn't hear the response.
Oh, okay. Nobody responded. I accidentally hit the mute. You didn't miss anything. I just want to make sure that we're with me. All right. Oh, so I mean,
It's a good
just
question.
yeah.
It's making me think.
What are the important issues to you that you feel like you need to speak about? Personal issue.
What was the answer?
He said global warming.
What? The environment? I mean, I think that's a legitimate response, right? Are you looking for something else?
I'm just trying to like pry and trying to help everybody highlight like what's something really important that you feel that you need to speak up.
Mhm.
Maybe not an issue, but something that I don't, like I can't tolerate is watching somebody be like humiliated. I feel like it's very, it's just a behavior I can't watch and not do something. Not know if it's like a world issue, but it's just something that I won't sit with.
Mhm. Like when someone's doing
Something
something.
to someone else who's like on purpose to make them feel bad or like humiliate them in front of a group or like maybe bullying is a better word, but I really can't tolerate it. I just,
Like trying to embarrass them
Yeah.
in front of people.
yeah. Bullying, I think that's really hard, especially between adults. It's very, very poor behavior.
Um, not humiliating, but excluding other people.
Hmm?
I say excluding people.
Oh, excluding people.
I like it.
And one of the, just in light of this month and and the Pride Month and all the different things that I've been reading, I feel like this is now becoming an issue that I feel like I want to speak on and want to address, even though it's I don't feel like it's perfect in the way that I'm addressing it, but for me, this is like becoming an issue of significance. Other question is kind of in follow-up to that is, what is something you're afraid of losing if you speak about or speak up about the previous issue?
Friends.
Alright, so friends.
Social status or respect or
Mm.
tolerance.
Social status, respect, or tolerance.
Friends. I know. Friends. I say,
And I think I think on speaking up on some of these issues, like as a church, we're building up partnerships within the neighborhood, and I feel like, okay, to be clear about where I stand on this issue, where we as the church stand on this issue, could lose certain partnerships within the community. That's something that I think about. All right. Then we're going to go ahead. We're going to go ahead and get started with our story for today, and kind of the story that we're gonna focus on is Esther, because Esther is somebody who exhibits a retail courage, but there were definitely some obstacles to her courage. There's definitely some obstacles to her courage, and because we're not going to read the whole book, and we're going to focus on just like a few sections of the book. I want to give a little bit of background information on it because Esther exists in this post-exilic period, and when we say post-exilic, so it's after the Israelites were conquered by the Babylonians, and they went to Babylon for 70 years, and then finally they were allowed to come back in waves of people. There were some people who ended up staying in the land, right? They just acclimated and they got used to staying there and living there. And so they stayed there. And so Esther is part of the group of people that ended up staying behind because they had just made life for themselves there, while some went back to Jerusalem. So the Jews were the minority. The Jews were the minority in the land, and they, still carried their different beliefs and their different practices. At the time, it was King Ahasuerus who was, the king of the land, and he threw this big party that lasted for many days. And part of the party was he wanted to show off his Queen Vashti, and when he called for her, she didn't concede to be paraded, and so he got rid of her. Right, that's just what the king did, and so he went on the search for a new queen. And that's when he had his people go out throughout the kingdom, find all the beautiful women, and one by one he met them until he would find his next queen. And Esther was that person that the king chose to make his queen. And Esther was a Jew. She had no parents. And so she was living with an older cousin, and that older cousin was Mordecai. And Mordecai was pretty much a parent to her, and he said, okay, when you go, you cannot tell anybody that you're a Jew, right? Just keep it silent. And so out of obedience, she listened. And so Esther became queen, and Mordecai worked around the palace, but not necessarily in close to the king. So he worked around the palace. He was around there, and Haman is another main character. And Haman he was promoted to become one of the king's closest advisors, where he was kind of over all the different princes and provinces. And Haman was really bothered by Mordecai, because Mordecai wouldn't bow down and give him respect, right? And this just boiled Haman. And so instead of just taking out Mordecai, what Haman decided to do is, once he found out that Mordecai was a Jew, he wanted to attack all the Jews, right? This was his way of getting back at Mordecai. And we read that in Esther chapter 3 is where we're going to pick up this story. And if somebody doesn't mind reading, actually, I'll just get it started with chapter 3. We'll read verses 5 and 6. Right? This kind of paints this picture of the relationship between Mordecai and Haman. And he says, when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So Haman has this idea of how he's going to get back at Mordecai, right? And it's through his people. And then, as he's brewing on this plan, he eventually goes to the king. And if somebody can read verses 8 through 11 captures this conversation between Mordecai and King Ahasuerus, right? So if somebody has Esther chapter 3, verses 8 through 11.
I can read it. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all the other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you.
So when we look at this picture, what does Haman have at his disposal?
The ear of the king.
Everything.
Okay, but what is it? right? I agree, like, it's easy to say everything, but what is it?
The attention of the king.
Okay. Not just the attention, but he got the ring of
The
the king,
ring.
right? So that's the authority or the power, right? You got the signet ring, you got the power. What else?
I mean, it's gonna sound kind of funny to say, but he also has at his disposal an ignorant king, clearly.
Okay, so,
Because he's also like, oh, there's these people, they're not against you. How about it? What do you think we should get rid of them?
Hmm.
He's like, oh, okay. You know, so clearly the king is not,
he's not all there, right?
he's not all
I
that.
think, sorry to interrupt, but I think one problem is, so this, his name in Persian was Xerxes, and he was preparing an invasion of, he invaded Greece, so maybe he's preparing an invasion of Greece at the time this is going on, and maybe his mind's on other things. Because he was he had a lot of vanity, and probably he's thinking of much loftier things than this little issue that Haman's bringing up.
Right, and so I mean, actually, when I say ignorant, I actually mean it literally. So what you're saying is true, you know, it's not like I don't mean he's like not with it, I mean, he's just, or like that he's not intelligent. I mean, like you're saying, he's just not, he's ignorant of that situation.
Okay, definitely ignorant to the issues,
Yeah.
you know, at play. That essentially, Haman is planning a local genocide of the Jews. You know, like, so he has not only like the signet ring and you know, the power of the king, but he has resources because the king is saying like, the money and the people are given to you, right? So he's got money, not just money, he's also got, you know, the manpower, right? So he's got the power of the king, the money of the king, and the manpower of the king, right? He's got it all, right? And when you kind of think of kind of everything that Haman has on his side, and then kind of like jump back to whatever situation you're feeling the need to be courageous in. Oftentimes we look at who we're sometimes like looking at and saying like, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to take you on? You have power, you have resources, you have influence, you have all this. Like a lot of times, like we can like look at the people we're going up against or the ideologies that sometimes we're going up against or the behaviors and be like, oh my gosh, what do I have to fight you? And that's really hard. Like sometimes we face government, we face mainstream media, we face, you know, pharmaceutical companies, corporations, you know, our local organizations, we face school boards, like we face a lot of people who we look at and we're like, you have power, authority, money, and resources. And all I got is my voice, you know, against you. So it's very easy to just say like, oh my God, what's the point? What's the point? Right? And I think this sets the stage for courage. Because in order to take this on, in order to like go forward in this endeavor, it's going to require courage because you're looking and like, okay, it seems like you got everything and I got nothing. It's like a little convenience store saying, I'm going to take on Amazon, right? It's like Amazon's got everything. They got UPS, they got FedEx, and and the United States Postal Service. Like they have everything. How am I going to survive, right? So we tend to highlight the little that we have: the money, the voices, the few supporters, right? And we also, in light of having little, we tend to focus on what is at stake, right? I have little, and if I choose to go about it, I can also lose a lot, right? So it's this like balancing act in our minds of like, what are my resources, what are my ability, and what am I going to lose? And if we see little resources with a lot to lose, a lot of times we're like, okay, forget it. Like somebody else is going to have to step up. Right? And so with all these resources as at his disposal, Haman goes and does the following. And that's what we're going to read. If somebody can read Esther chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. Bible here, I have everything.
3 verse 12.
12 through 15.
Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded. To the king's satraps, to the governors who are over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language, in the name of King
Ahasuerus.
what is it?
Ahasuerus.
Ahasuerus, it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers into the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed.
Oh. So I think in light of what Sarah and Matthew were saying about like the king being ignorant, like to the issues, like all this stuff is happening and he sits down to have a drink with Haman, right? It's like nothing. He's essentially authorized for a genocide to happen in his country and throughout his land. And he's like, all right, let's pop him back. Right? This is the mind of the king. Right. So very detached from what's going on. But just look how quickly everything happened. Right? He got the scribes, he got the couriers, he got the the papyrus or whatever they were writing on. Everything was happening. And this is a lot of times like
People in every language, they got
exactly
translators.
and translators. Like you couldn't look at this and be like, oh my gosh, this is such a lopsided endeavor to try and overcome. So, this is so picturesque of what it is we're dealing with today. When we look at some of these key issues, that are dear to our hearts, like we feel like we're up against like giants, right? And Esther and Mordecai were up against giants, right? But this sets the stage for courage. Now let's go to the next scene, which chapter 4. We're going to spend a lot of time in chapter 4, essentially, which will take up most of the rest of our time. So if somebody can read 4 verses 1 through 4. Go ahead.
When Mordecai learned all that happened, he tore his clothes and put sackcloth and ashes, and went into the midst of the city. He cried with a loud voice and a bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them.
All right. So, question. How would you characterize Esther's initial response to the mourning that she is catching wind of Mordecai and the Jews? And bear in mind, at this point, for the details that we have, she doesn't know what the decree is. But how would you characterize her response? Or what is her response like? Tell us about her and possibly even like us when we face some issues initially.
She doesn't really understand what's happening.
She doesn't understand what happened.
It almost seems to be in some form of denial where she doesn't really know how to react. Like, what use of it is to give Mordecai mourning clothes? That's going to fix anything.
Well, she was trying to give him different clothes because he was mourning, and she sent him regular clothes. But you're right. Where like, okay, what is that going to do? But what is that saying about like her?
She's probably like scared.
That's scared. Okay, so something serious is happening.
just wants to bury it.
Okay, she wants to bury it, she wants to move on, right? Change your clothes, Mordecai, it's not that bad. Like, I'm the queen, right? How bad could it be? Right? So in our lack of understanding of issues, or even detachment from the issues, we can, to an extent, turn and look away. Right? We can look the other way. And I think that says more, that should bring us to our, ignorance about certain issues when we, when we downplay them. And also, it should challenge us, like when we see many people reacting, to kind of poke at ourselves and say, okay, maybe I'm missing something. Right? If my response is like, well, let me zip my lips, or let me walk the other way, or let me just avoid certain situations or certain meetings, right? That says something about me more than it does about the issue. And what I'm not trying to say is that at any junction or any cause for alarm should we be jumping up and causing and running our mouth. No, like we can't have an error in our response, but we should also see that our lack of response or our desire to just look the other way or ignore it or to bury it, right? That's not an appropriate response either. So we have to strike a balance. Like we have to say like, okay, well, maybe I need to look at this a little bit more rather than just look past this. Because in the face of opposition, we tend to become, we turn inwards and we work towards self-preservation, right? That's our go-to, is we will preserve ourselves. And Mordecai being in the thick of it and knowing all the details of it, he has moved past self-preservation into, this is an issue that I cannot look the other way. I cannot let this go, right? Whether the queen is my cousin or not, I cannot let this go, right? So education, what we're going to say is education goes a long way. Can somebody read Esther chapter 4, verses 5 through 9?
I'll do it. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, that he might command her to go into the king, to make supplication to him, and to plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai.
So a big step that we can all take in building up courage is really learning and understanding what the issues really are. When we learn what the issues are, when we learn more about what it is we're dealing with or what we're up against, right? That helps us work towards courage. Additionally, like what we need to think about is what is at stake if I don't say anything, right? Or kind of two questions is what's at stake, and then what's at stake if I stay silent in the situation. Right? These are questions that we need to begin to ask ourselves, like what's going to happen, and what's going to happen if I don't do something. All right. So the power of taking a stand by Mordecai kind of began to pave the way for Esther to grow in her courage, because when she knew that she couldn't convince Mordecai, and Mordecai was like a fatherly figure, even though he was her cousin, he was a fatherly figure, and so Mordecai wouldn't be silent in his moment. And for sure, this sparked something in Esther. And oftentimes, like we need to look at other people, show signs of courage for us to begin to catch that courage. And likewise, like when we begin to show signs of courage, we're highlighting or we're encouraging somebody else to step up to the plate, right? So courage can be contagious, right? It's good for us to see it, but when we see it, can we build on it, right? And kind of look at our situation and say, like, how can I add to what's happening, right? How can I play my part in the situation, right? Any questions so far? All right, let's look at 10 through 14. Chapter 4.
Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him the command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one whom he holds the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I have not been called to go to the king these 30 days. So Mordecai told Esther these words. So they told Mordecai Esther's words.
14.
And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?
Thank you. There are always obstacles to courage, right? And like, while none of us are going into the king's court, we do face obstacles that are like, well, but this is how we do things, right? This is how the mode of operation, right? Or no one speaks in this way during our meetings, right? These are the obstacles that we face. Or my coworkers won't appreciate it if I say something, right? Or my friends are going to distance themselves if I share my views. These are all the obstacles that we face, right? And this is just the same as Esther looking and saying, like, nobody goes into the king's court. Everybody knows this is a law, as immutable as gravity. And the only person who makes it out is who gets the scepter, right? Like courage has an obstacle. That's why courage has two parts to it, right? It's this personal choice that we make, and it's fueled by purpose. Esther has a purpose, but she also has a personal choice that she has to make, right? Esther knew the purpose behind taking the action. It was, saving her uncle and saving all the Jews. But she had to choose and say, this could mean my life. That's a tough choice, right? That's a tough choice. But that's courage, right? That's courage. One of the biggest obstacles that we face in courage comes in our avoidance of personal risk. We are so good at like risk mitigation and minimizing risk and like thinking about risk, and the thought of sacrificing our jobs, our positions, our relationships, our partnerships, like all these different things, like that risk is just, we think about it and we almost ruminate over it over and over and over, like, oh, how can I do that? How can I like possibly lose this? And all these become the obstacles to risk. And that's why courage is a choice, right? It's a choice, but it is a choice that when fueled by God's purpose and we see his hand moving, we're more readily going to take that choice, right? And make that decision. Right? And courage doesn't come without risk. And actually, the only way we can know courage and are able to identify courage is when there is risk. Like if you think of any picture, if you were to describe courage, you couldn't describe it without articulating the risk built into the situation. That's how we can identify courage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting to hear like those verses after each other are so interesting, right? It's like the way Mordecai is talking, there's this like opportunity for really great victory and for really great tragedy. Like one right after another.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like a seminal moment in her life, right? You're either gonna choose this like amazing victory. You're gonna be there's this possibility that you could be a hero because you chose courage in this really frightening situation. Or there could be this really horrible tragedy, and it's not just the loss of the lives of people. It's like you not discovering like God's great purpose for you.
Yeah.
It's just there's just so much crap captured there.
Yeah. And like you think like, how many of us just go about our days and like, what's the point of what I'm doing? Where's the purpose behind like my actions, my life, like what I say, who I engage with? Like a lot of times like we lack purpose because we live such risk-averse lives. But when there's a bit of risk like woven into what we do, like there's a great sense of purpose, and that is so powerful too, right? To be able to live with that sense of purpose. So really nice point. Really nice point. All right. Let's look at verses 15 and 17. I'll go ahead and read those. It says, Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. For 3 days, nights or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded. Right? And it can't be stressed enough the place and action of prayer and fasting. Right? And it's so critical because this act of prayer and fasting begins to place our trust in the situation in the right place. Right? It takes it out of our hands. We're like, okay, I really have no idea what will happen, but I will put this trust in you, right? I will, I can think of all the possible outcomes, right? And believing all the possible outcomes. But fasting and prayer brings in all the potential outcomes that we can't think of, right? It includes them in the process because we're saying, okay, this is what I think could happen, but there's always something that I don't know. And that's what I'm kind of hoping for, right? I'm hoping that it comes from you because I can't see past the options that I can play out in my mind. But you are God. You are creator of all. You have at your disposal, right? So much more than power, money, and manpower, right? Which we looked at the beginning, right? So we see like our opponents sometimes having. But when we put prayer and fasting into it, we're saying, okay, you have all that I can see, but the Lord has everything I can't see, right? So it levels the playing field, so to speak, right? Prayer and fasting is always said to like, it weakens us physically. And if you can imagine like not eating or drinking for 3 days straight, that's a physical weakness, right? You'll be fatigued, but it strengthens and sharpens the mind and the spirit at the same time, right? There's a physical weakness, but there's a strengthening of the mind and the spirit, right? It makes us firm in our convictions, and it turns our sense of purpose, and and in turn, our sense of purpose and determination grows, right? And the other thing that happens in this time of fasting and prayer is it refines our approach. It begins to season our words, right? And all the things that we're thinking like, okay, how am I gonna, say this? How am I gonna articulate this? What am I gonna do in this situation? That process of fasting and prayer seasons like all our words and our actions with salt, right? And all the while that we're fasting and praying, what happens is that God is constantly at work. He's constantly like putting the right things, the right pieces in place, right? And what we have as we're growing in our strength, like it all kind of culminates in this divine orchestrated like moment, right? That only God can put together. And that's what we see happening in chapter 5, verses 1 and 3. If somebody can read that. Your mouth is full. Thank you. Go ahead, Mary.
Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom."
Isn't this awesome? Like, not only like, what an amazing moment, because it's not only did she get the scepter, but she got this wish, right? Her life wasn't just saved, but now it's like, what do you want? And this is the power of God. This is like God putting the right things into the right place at the right time and the right mood and everything, and where in just, a few moments ago, all the momentum was on the other side. And in a matter of a moment, there's a total shift, right? And that's the ability of God. That's the ability of God to change it. So not only did she find favor with the scepter, but she got a wish from the king, right? Which is, yes, it's coming from the king's mouth, but we know that behind this, like God is orchestrating this, right? And so what Esther does is, she invites the king and Haman to the banquet later that night, right? And they come to the banquet, they have a nice, nice meal, and then at the end of the banquet, the king says, "Okay, well, what do you want? Right? You tell me." And then the king, or then Esther says, like, "Come back tomorrow night, and I'm gonna have another banquet." Right? That's my wish. And we don't have a clear reason as to why Esther did that. Like, could she have gotten nervous in the situation? Who knows, right? I don't know exactly. But for whatever reason, she asked him to come back, and kind of this 24 hours between night 1 and night 2 served as just enough opportunity to create the greatest humiliation story ever, which was Haman and Mordecai. And just given time, I'm not going to get into it, but go and read these chapters. I think it's quite funny. But the point is, when we get to the second night, right? Regardless of why, we get to the second night, and it's the second night that's key. And these are the last couple of verses that we're going to read. So if somebody can read chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, because they have dinner, and then after dinner, the king turns to Queen Esther. Right? Somebody can read chapter 4 or chapter 7, 1 through 7.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you said 1 through 7.
Sorry,
or 1 through 4?
chapter 7, 1 through 4.
Okay, so the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom? It shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss."
All right. So here it is, like Esther's defining moment, where she speaks, the truth clearly and succinctly, and it's so powerful, right? It's so powerful, right? She's clear that her and her people are under attack, and if nothing is done, it's going to lead to her death and the death of her people, which for the king is a loss because they're like good citizens in Babylon, right? Or not in Babylon, but they're good in Persia. They're good citizens and they're helping out and they're honest people. And so it's a loss. Like these are good workers. And so there is a loss to the king. And she even says, like, if we were going to be sold as slaves, I wouldn't say anything. But the threshold, like for her to say something was, okay, we're going to die, right? There's going to be a genocide. I have to do something. And everybody's got a different threshold for their issue, right? Everybody has a different threshold. And she speaks and he listens and he's like, okay, who is this? And she points to Haman, and Haman eventually gets hanged for this, and the story continues, right? And the Jews ultimately understand that's not like our focus here. Our focus here is the courage of Esther, right? Up until this point. And I think we've seen, how there's this, narrative, if you will, that leads up to courage. That it's not so much like a switch. It's not so like, here's the moment and it's all on this moment and I got to do something. Are there stories like that? Yes, right? But by and large, many of us have this opportunity to continue to work towards courage. Right? And in our work towards courage, we will have to get accustomed to taking on this. The two are inseparable. When we learn to be clear on the purpose of why we're doing things, we're more likely to make the choice to take on the risk. And in doing so, we exhibit courage, but we give others courage as well. Right? And that's a beautiful thing. But there's no way to get around that risk. And there's no way to look at the story of Esther without looking at the risk she took of potentially losing her life. The risk is part of the game. The courage is very, very bad. That's all I have. Any questions, thoughts?
I think sometimes it's surprising, at least I find that when I choose courage, I am sometimes surprised that I'm not as alone as I thought I was. Or as you said, maybe I encouraged somebody else, or they've encouraged me, or I just think there's this often the deception that I am alone in my desire to be courageous discourages me even further. Like that's where I decide to be sheepish and not speak up and miss an opportunity. But I think when I recognize that there's a ripple effect, it's much more encouraging. And I think I'm going to be thinking about your question from the beginning for a while. Like, what is it that makes me repeat the question? Sorry, you asked it at the beginning.
The question is, what issue?
What issue do you feel that you want to act
Yes.
About
The questions.
and what prevents you?
What are important issues to you that you feel you need to speak up about? Right.
And what prevents you?
And then what is something you're afraid to lose if you speak up about?
when you have once you actually be courageous and like feel a lot better. And you're proud that you did it.
And that is a whole sense of purpose. You're right. You feel better because you're living with purpose.
I think that, not to go back to that, but I think that my answer would be to the question is, I think it's very, very common to hear off-color comments about Christianity these days. Very, very, very common for people to say things that are just inappropriate, bashing our God, right? And I think that those are moments where I always want to have a keen ear that I don't, I have in my mind, I don't want to deny him so that he will not deny me.
No, I mean, I'm like, I constantly reflect back on a conversation, like to your point of just like not speaking up, where I was actually meeting with one of the local like pastors, and we were just talking about like different neighborhood like partnerships that we can explore. And at the end, very end of our conversation, he just said, yeah, me and my husband and our kids. And I'm just like, I froze. And I didn't agree to anything. I was like, oh, I guess I'll just get back to you. Right. And I never did. And I'm just like, oh, there was nothing like courageous. And what I was afraid of was like the risk of like partnership, the risk of what like people would say, like as we're like a new church and a new like, priest in the community. What are they going to say? Or what is he going to like go and say? And like, there's all this risk. And now, as I was, preparing this and just looking at Esther and just seeing like her initial reaction to the threat when not knowing what the issues were. And I really resonated with that because 2 years ago when I had this conversation, I'm like, okay, I know I don't agree with it, but like I haven't like gone into the issues deeply. And now after like this month and kind of preparing for our open forum and the different discussions, and I've really gone into like several books, I'm like, oh my gosh, how did I not say something? Right. And now I'm like, I know what I would say and I know how I like address it. Right. And that education process has like kind of not fueled me, but like given me more courage to say, no, this is something I have to speak up about. Right. So I don't know. That is my personal kind of reflection on the question and the story of Esther. I'm like, okay, I know I'm going to run into this situation again. But now, God willing, like I would have the words. So,
If I can comment on that, I think that sometimes things happen in an instant where you don't have a lot of time to think before, reacting the proper way. Whereas in Esther's situation, she thought about it and she prayed about it for 3 days and 3 nights. So it's sort of a different situation. She didn't respond quickly.
yeah, she didn't. And actually, to add to your point, like this conversation between her and Mordecai likely took a period of time because she was like sending people out of the palace, bringing people back into the palace. They're like, it's 3 days, but it was actually a lot more than 3 days, right? That this transpired, and you're right, a lot can happen in time, but like she was proactive in kind of embracing the situation and using the situation to kind of sharpen her understanding of it, which led her to, eventually be in the king's court. So there, like, I really like your point that, there was time, right? There are always moments and we will miss moments, but we have to reflect on those moments and say, what was it that I was afraid of? What was pulling me back? And how do I equip myself to, to be better prepared for the next moment? Because there's always a next moment. There's always going to be a next moment, right? And that's the beauty. Like I saw this time looking at Esther, I'm like, wow, she kind of failed that first moment, right? But she figured it out. Thank you, Mary, for sharing. All right, let's close in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. We thank you, Lord, for all your blessings. We thank you for the story of Esther and the courage she exhibited, Lord. Help us to reflect on ourselves, reflect on the risk that is before us, and help us each to dig deep inside and through prayer and fasting, find your divine purpose in our life. For Lord, you invite all of us and each of us in our own unique way to partner with you on so many different issues and in so many different situations. Lord, we tend to choose the route of self-preservation. Help us, Lord, to choose to be courageous, to take on the risk that accompanies courage, and let us be used by you for something greater than just ourselves. Be with all my brothers and sisters here and prepare us for this week and this society that we live in. Through the intercessions of all your saints who have pleased you from the beginning, hear us as we say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. To Christ Jesus our Lord. For thine is the kingdom and power and glory. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. Next week it's our last part of this series, and then we're taking a break for summer. And we are going to be at